Hi everyone, my name is Gal, and today I want to tell you the story of how ChatGPT got me drunk. So our story begins with me lately been getting into making cocktails. So lately I've bought all the equipment, I got the shaker, I got the jigger, I got the strainers, my liquor cabinet tripled its size, and I've gotten into the habit of inviting friends over, making cocktails, having fun. I really like this hobby. The problem is that after 10 or 15 times of making the same cocktails, I kind of got tired of the classics. I made the whiskey sour and I made the basil smash, and I just wanted to find some more inspiring recipes, something that's a bit more interesting. And there are some recipes online, of course, and you can go to Google and search for cocktail recipes, but cocktails ingredients are kind of weird. Every cocktail has its own specific ingredients, and you can't just kind of wing it. You have to go and buy 6 or 7 different kind of liquors. It's pretty annoying. So I wanted a way for me to be able to say, here's what I have at home, and the response should be, here's the cocktails that you can make. And the websites, the way that they're built today, if you're just looking on Google for a cocktail, it's just not built that way. You can search for cocktails with gin, you can search for cocktails with rum, but you can't search for cocktails with gin, yellow charcuteries, and tomatoes. It just doesn't work. And there are some apps that do that, but they cost money, and I don't like cocktails that much. And really, the data is out there, right? The recipes are on the internet, and all I had to do was kind of index them in a way that would make them more searchable for me. And that was kind of a pet project that I've had in mind for years, or at least in the last year. And I've always told myself that one day I'll do it, one day I'll make this application, maybe I'll write a blog post about it, it'll be cool. And then in November this year, everything changed. OpenAI launched ChatGPT. Everyone saw how awesome it is. The LinkedIn was filled with posts about, here's what I made ChatGPT do, here's this cool thing that I did, here's how I hacked ChatGPT, here's how I reversed ChatGPT. And I wanted to take it for a spin as well. And I've decided that instead of building this application on my own, I'll actually ask ChatGPT to build it for me, and I'll have the application, the cocktail application of my dreams. So this was the game plan. The application is relatively simple. It's made of a couple of components. You have the crawler, which crawls a specific cocktail website or a specific website for cocktail recipes. It puts them into a queue just because I was running everything on my Mac, and I wanted to be able to run the crawler and the indexer independently. Then you have the indexer, who basically takes those recipes, extracts the ingredients, and put them into the recipe DB. And then you have an application with an API and the UI on top of it, which you can query the cocktails based on what you have at home. So this is what I'll talk about today, how ChatGPT actually helped me build this application from end to end, and what I've learned throughout the way. A little bit about me. My name is Gal Bashan. I'm the head of engineering at Hexagon, which was recently acquired by Cisco. Other than cocktails, I love bouldering. I'm from Tel Aviv in Israel. And this is my Twitter handle if you want to say only good things. OK, so let's start. And I thought I'd warm up ChatGPT with a simple task. And I've basically asked ChatGPT, hey, ChatGPT, what queue should I use in this application? And I've kind of described what I wanted. I've described that I have an indexer, and I have a crawler, and it should crawl website, and it should run independently. And I kind of laid out the requirement. And ChatGPT didn't hesitate. It said, hey, there are a couple of good options. I recommend RabbitMQ. And that makes sense. I know RabbitMQ. It's a pretty good fit for this project. It makes sense as a decision. So I went ahead with it and asked ChatGPT, hey, can you please guide me to how to use RabbitMQ? And again, to nobody's surprise in this room, ChatGPT outputted a little RabbitMQ hello world. This is how you should work with RabbitMQ. This is how you should publish a message. This is how you should read a message. We've all seen the LinkedIn posts on ChatGPT doing far more impressive things, but still it was nice. It also helped me set it up on my Mac because I had some problems. And that was it. The queue was ready, and I was ready to start building the crawler. Now, the crawler is a bit more interesting. For those of you who are not familiar, a web crawler is basically a script that gets a domain or a website and scrapes it for X. In my case, I'm scraping it for cocktail recipes. I'm going to take the first link, get the page, check if it's a cocktail recipe. If it is, I'll put it in the queue for further processing. If it's not, I'll look for additional links in this page, and I'll schedule them for processing as well. I'll start scraping them as well recursively, and the end would be me scanning all the pages in a specific site. So I've asked ChatGPT to do that. I've given a relatively specific instruction. I have this crawler. It should output it to a 2-index queue. And if you found additional links, you should put them into another 2-scan queue. And you can see that at the end, I've asked it to output only example code and no explanation. I've done this project around December or January. And this was when ChatGPT was just launched, so it had a lot of downtime and not a lot of computing resources before the response was truncated. So I've asked it to really just give me what I need. No explanations. I know how to code. Just give me the output that I need. And it kind of obliged. It mostly gave me code. There was like a line at the beginning or a line at the end, maybe. And to my surprise, it gave me a fully functioning web scraper. Like, it compiled, even though it's Python. It compiled on the first run. I just executed it. It worked. And that was pretty impressive. I didn't think it would be that good. But still, there were two problems with this web scraper. The first one was that it didn't deduplicate URLs. What does that mean? If I'll go to liqueur.com, for example, because I want to scan for cocktail recipes, and I'll start scanning the main page, I'll probably see a link to a cocktail recipe, let's say liqueur.com/a. And then if I'll go to that page, it will most certainly link back to liqueur.com. You have this liqueur.com logo on the top left side. If you click on it, you go back to liqueur.com. And what ends up happening is that if I scan liqueur.com/a, I add again liqueur.com to the scan queue, and then when I scan liqueur.com, I find liqueur.com/a again. I add liqueur.com/a to the scan queue, and this loop goes on forever. So I've asked ChatGPT to do that. You can notice that I didn't tell him how to solve the problem. I just told him that there is a problem, and please don't insert the item into the queue if it's been in there in the last 2 hours, and I let it up for him to figure out how to solve that. The second thing is that the crawler didn't stick to the initial domain. So if I'm crawling liqueur.com, for example, and liqueur.com is embedding a YouTube video on how to make a specific cocktail, there's a link to youtube.com/blah, blah, blah. And if I'll follow that link, I'll start seeing in that page more link to youtube.com, because YouTube tends to link to itself. And what I end up doing is scanning youtube.com instead of liqueur.com, where the page to cocktail ratio is not very good. So I really wanted to focus on the website that I've asked to scan, and I've asked him not to scan links that are across a different domain. And it did it relatively well. It morphed the answer. It took the code that it gave me, and it changed it to suit those new requirements. So on the left, you can see that it added a cache, and it won't insert stuff into the queue if it has inserted the same URL in the last 2 hours. On the right side, you can see that he's parsing the domain, and he follows and scanning only if the domain matches. And this is interesting because you can see that ChatGPT doesn't only understand domains or only understand code. It can actually get requirements in the domain of domains and understand how to code them in Python. So that's actually was a pretty cool thing to see. And after I got over those two hiccups, I had the indexer up and running, and I was happy. I had the web crawler that I wanted. I was scanning liqueur.com, and I was outputting all the semi-cocktail or stuff that looks like a cocktail recipe into a queue for the indexer to actually decide if it is a cocktail indeed. So I had the queue, I had the crawler, and now it was time to build the indexer. Now, back before ChatGPT, this was the part that always puzzled me, because it's very hard to just look at the page and understand if it contains a cocktail recipe or not. I mean, for us as humans, it's relatively easy. It's not super easy because those pages aren't built for humans. They are built for SEO. So if you're not familiar with SEO, search engine optimization, it basically means that the better score that these web pages get, the higher it will be on the Google search result. That gives the author of this article the incentive to please Google instead of pleasing me. And instead of getting the recipe of Kentucky Made, I'm getting the life story of someone tasting Kentucky Made for the first time and him changing jobs to become a fisherman because of it. And this is not very interesting to me. I just want to get the Kentucky Made recipe. So even though as a human I can still find the recipe, but this text is very, very unstructured and every website is very different. So up until ChatGPT, I didn't have a real way to parse this unstructured data and understand if it contained the cocktail recipe, and if it does, to extract it in a structured way. But ChatGPT opened up this whole new world of possibilities. Because with ChatGPT, what I thought I'll do is basically craft a prompt that says the following. I'm going to attach a bulk of text. If it contains a recipe for a cocktail, extract the ingredient in the format ABC, otherwise do nothing. And I've tested it out with ChatGPT, and it works pretty good. I just copy-pasted entire pages into ChatGPT with this prompt, and the output was the cocktail recipe in a very formatted way, and I was very happy with myself, and I was just about to build the indexer, but then I hit another block, which is how do I talk to ChatGPT? Because that was back in January, and there was no official OpenAI API, and the only way to interact with ChatGPT was actually the UI client. And this was pretty annoying, because I wanted to interact with ChatGPT programmatically. So lucky for me, after a little search on the web, I found Antonio Cheng, and I hope I'm saying it right, who is a high school student who is working on some cool projects, so after high school he can find work. And what Antonio did back in November and early December was actually to reverse engineer ChatGPT's API and to produce a Python library that lets me interact with ChatGPT instead of using the UI. Now, the interesting part is if you're looking at, and this repository still exists today. Today it uses the OpenAI standard API. But if you look at the commit history of this repository to around December and Thanksgiving and not Thanksgiving, sorry, and Christmas and the beginning of January, you're actually seeing a war between OpenAI and Antonio. OpenAI are hardening their defenses, adding more ways to prevent reverse engineering, adding Cloudflare, and you can see commits after commits, work around X, work around Y, work around Cloudflare. It's pretty amazing that he did this. So huge shout out to him, because without it, this whole project wouldn't have been possible. Other than that, he has a couple other cool open source projects. I don't know if he found a job yet, but if he didn't, then I'd recommend hiring him. But after I had the ChatGPT reverse engineered API, I could craft my question. And the question, as I said, this was pretty much the whole code, right? I didn't have a lot of code aside from this, maybe establishing the connection. Hey, dear ChatGPT, I'm going to attach a bulb of text. Please extract the cocktail instructions from it if it exists in the following way, and there's a detailed description of the format. Otherwise, just output no. And it worked pretty well. This is from a manual test that I did on a recipe called Pink Cougar. And you can see that it actually extracts the instructions in a way that I can work with. So we have the indexer, but we need to write the data that ChatGPT created into the database. In order for that to do that, we need to create a database and parse the data. So again, I've asked ChatGPT to create the database, and this is going to be a motive throughout this conversation, right? I don't like doing things myself. So I've asked ChatGPT, hey, I'm building this application. I need a table for cocktails. I need a table for ingredients. Please do that for me. ChatGPT had no problem. It just gave me the tables. Here's how you create them. But then I was too lazy to parse ChatGPT result, right? While it was structured, when it was a web page, I didn't know how to parse it. But even this response is kind of annoying to parse, right? We all know that parsing text is pretty annoying. So again, I've just asked ChatGPT to do it for me. He was familiar with the database format. So I've asked him, hey, take this example string and just write code that inserts it into the database. And I've asked it to do it with my favorite ORM, so he's actually producing SQL Alchemy code, and he's formatting the table based on the rows that he created. And then all I had to do, basically, was just replace the input line, which is hard-coded, with calling the reading from the queue and calling the ChatGPT API to ask him to convert the web page from a blob of text to a structured cocktail-making instructions. And the rest of it just worked out of the box, and I had the indexer running as well. So at this point, I have a crawler. He's collecting data from a cocktail website. He's pushing it into a queue. And then we have the indexer using ChatGPT to extract the actual cocktail recipe from the page and insert it into the database. The next thing that I needed to do was actually build the application on top of it that lets me query this database. Because right now I had the database of my dreams. The cocktails were indexed by ingredients. I could search by what I have at home, and I could get drunk faster. But I needed to actually be able to query the database, and SQL didn't seem like a reasonable solution. So I've decided to build this web app. And this web app would have 2 pages. The first one would be a list of all the available ingredients in the database. And me as a user, I'll be able to mark which one of them I have at home with a simple checkbox. And then I can go to the bottom of the page, hit search, and I'll see a list of the cocktail recipes. And they'll be sorted by how many of the ingredients I have at home. So if I have all the ingredients for a specific cocktail, it'll be at the top of the list. And if I don't have any of the ingredients, it'll be at the bottom of the list. So in order to build this application, and I'll start with the API, I had 2 relatively simple routes. One for the first page, where I need to get all the available ingredients in the database. And then for the second page, a route that gets a list of selected ingredients and return a sorted list of cocktails. This one was no match for ChatGPT. It easily cooked up a Flask web server that serves it. And I didn't include it in this session, in this presentation, but I've even made it a bit harder for him. And I've asked him to return some more responses which require some advanced SQL capabilities. And he popped up very complex SQL queries involving counts and subqueries, which would have taken me a long time to produce. And he did that almost flawlessly. So I have the crawler, I have the indexer, I have the API. The only thing that's left is to build the UI on top of it to complete the experience. So I did pretty much the reasonable thing to do. And I've asked ChatGPT to create the first page. Hey, ChatGPT, can you please create a page that renders the list of available ingredients in the database? And this part, it did with flying colors. It passed it with flying colors. Not only did it create a React component that actually renders the ingredients, but he knew the API because he had the context of the conversation. So he knew that the Flask was running locally on port 5000. He knew that the round was /ingredients. He knew what was the shape of the response. So it was relatively easy for him to code this part. And then I followed up with, OK, and this was after I asked him to add checkbox and stuff like that. Hey, so add the search button at the bottom. And once the search button is clicked, send over the selected ingredients and render the cocktails in the appropriate order. So ChatGPT started blurping up some code and started writing stuff. And after a while, what I got was an error. And this was pretty disappointing because up till now, ChatGPT did an amazing job. And I asked myself, what happened? What happened this time that was so hard for ChatGPT to complete the task? And what I've realized is that at least back then, back in January, I don't know about ChatGPT, like the GPT version 4, ChatGPT is kind of like a junior developer. And if you're a senior developer, you know that one of the main differences between a senior developer and a junior developer is that a senior developer, because of all the experience that he has, knows how to take a complicated task and break it down to simpler tasks, execute them, and then integrate it all together. And basically, what I've asked ChatGPT here is to kind of build an application, which is a complicated task because you need to make sense of what components it's made of and who manages the state of those components. And once I've realized that, I've decided to kind of be the senior developer that help junior ChatGPT solve this problem. So what I did was, OK, had I designed this application, how would I have designed it? There would be kind of two components, right? The ingredient list and the cocktail list. And then on top of that, there would be another component, which is, let's call it drink index. That's the name that I gave for the application, which manages the state and kind of passes the required the parameters and the selected ingredients between the two components. And that's what I did. I first asked him to build the cocktail list component. We already had the ingredient list component. And then finally, I've asked him to build the drink index component, which wraps the logic of those two. And the result was pretty fun. I had the application that I wanted. The first screen where you can actually select the ingredients. And it's actually the ingredients that are coming from the database. And then when you click search at the bottom, and there are a bunch of ingredients, so you don't see the search button there. But when you click search, you can see the cocktails based on how many ingredients you have. Now, before I refer to that, let me just say that the process that I've done with ChatGPT in order to make him produce those web pages is kind of similar to what's going on with AutoGPT today. If you're not familiar, AutoGPT is a project that kind of uses ChatGPT agents in order to perform complicated tasks. And the way that it does that is exactly like being a senior developer. It takes this complicated task and is asking ChatGPT first, before he's asking him to actually implement it, plan how you would have implemented this task. And then ChatGPT kind of responds with a series of actions that he would have taken had he needed to complete this task. And then AutoGPT creates additional agents that actually performs these tasks. And finally, the last agent integrates it all together. Or maybe there are some stages of integration in between to form the complicated final response. And so in this case, I kind of auto-GPT'd ChatGPT. I broke down the task for him so he'll be able to complete it. So that's it. I had this application, and I was pretty happy with it. The only problem was that it kind of looked like an application from when the internet was invented, right? It's not very appealing. It kind of looks like the first web page of someone discovering infranet or something. And I wanted to add some pizzazz. So I asked ChatGPT, hey, please make this application cooler. Now, I'm not a UI UX designer, so I didn't really have Figma designs to give him. But I did kind of guided him with a color palette, and I wanted a modern style, and I hoped that he would understand that. And it looked pretty well, right? It looks pretty good. It outputted an impressive CSS, and it knew that we were styling lists. So you can see that he's using, I don't know, it's kind of small, but he's using lists, is styling list items and lists and spans. And I was kind of eager to pop it into my application and see what comes up. And this is what came out. We're moving from the 80s to the 90s thing. I'm designing my first website when I'm 6 years old or something, I don't know. Not the kind of modern feel I was going for, but that was fine by me. I said, that's enough. I think that's a good result. And I settled on this application. Now let's talk a bit about what I've learned along the way. So the first interesting data point is that this whole project took less than 1 day. And when I say less than 1 day, it actually would have taken a lot less had I not been a stickler for only ChatGPT coding. Like, if I'd help him a little and fix some of the bugs myself instead of prompting him to fix the bugs, I think this is 2, maybe 3 hours work end-to-end. ChatGPT accelerated the way I developed in unprecedented ways. It just created functioning code. It wasn't boilerplate code. It actually did what I wanted, and I was pretty satisfied with the result. So what it did well? he was an awesome data engineer. He knew what queues to set up. He knew how to send messages to them. He knew how to work with, how to receive messages, how to work with data. He was a good backend engineer, just in general, could create web routes and work with databases. He was an okay UI engineer, at least from the structural standpoint. He did structure the application in a reasonable way. The UI wasn't great, but we'll talk about that later. And I think the thing that blew my mind was ChatGPT's ability to process unstructured data. This one it's not like a cool capability, it's an innovation. It's something it's a tool that we didn't possess before, and now we can use it to build applications with literally a click of a button. It opens up a whole new bunch of use cases, which I think we can use to make the world a better place. Okay, let's talk about what ChatGPT didn't do so well. So for any designers in the crowd, although this is a DevOps conference, so there are probably none, it won't replace you. So it's not a UI UX designer yet. They still don't have to fear for their jobs. I mean, they may have to fear for their jobs in like a year from now, but it's not. It's just not there yet, and I couldn't get a decent result from a UI perspective with it. And the second thing, like I've mentioned, is that it struggled with complex asks, and that's actually something that us as a world have already encountered. That's why AutoGPT came to be. But it's still something to consider. So kind of when I work with ChatGPT today, I'm not in the mindset of him doing the work for me. I'm in the mindset of I know what the job that I need to do. I know how I want the code to look, and I can push down some of the dirty work to him. But I still need to design. I still need to do the complicated things that will allow me to build software. Again, this may change in the upcoming year, but at least this was the state when I worked with it. And the last thing that I've learned is that cocktails are fun and drinking is not bad. Thank you. If you want to, thank you. If you want to read the full blog post, and it also has like a link to the GitHub repo, you can scan this QR code. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take some.
Thank you very much, Gal. Brilliant. That was fun. I'm a bit drunk now.
Hi. I love very much the comparison with a senior and junior developer. Recently, many things have been told about ChatGPT, including it can fake full scientific article, faking references to non-existent article. Okay, back to computer science. I was reading the other day on Slashdot that it may generate some code, but very poor security-wise. So the question would be, how can we trust a code that, yes, could be working, but actually would be so much junior developer?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that the problem's with security. Imagine him spitting out code and saying, yeah, it's working, but it's actually just not performing the functionality, right? And that happens.
But you can check it out. You can check out the functionality. But how about security, vulnerabilities, and things like that?
So that's a good question. And I think the way that I would think about it is how do we deal with our junior developers when it comes to security? So we have standards in place. We have tools in place. We have things that make sure that we don't let human error get in the way of our security. So in this case, maybe it's not human error, maybe it's artificial human error, but it's still there. And I would definitely not just take the code, copy paste it, and put it in production.
Hello.
Hi.
Quick question. How did ChatGPT know about the state, so the context of the issue? Did you feed him his previous answers and say, considering this code that you gave me yesterday, give me something new?
That's a very good question. I was hoping someone would ask that because it was super frustrating. When I was working with ChatGPT, it was back when it constantly crashed. So it's not like I could have, and it didn't have history back then. So it's not like I could just keep, a single conversation going and just him just remembering everything. So what I did to work around that was to constantly start a conversation with, here's what you built so far, a dump of code. Can you tell me what it does? And then he worked through what it does. And then I said, OK, so given this application, can you X, Y, Z? I know that today there are actually a few cool tools that you can do, you can use in order to improve on that. Because ChatGPT has history now, and it doesn't fail as often, especially if you pay OpenAI. There's a cool Chrome extension that actually lets you manage threads and different forks of chat. So if you, for example, I don't remember the name of it, but if you, for example, edit a question and then start a different line of questioning, it'll start it on a different thread ID, and then you can go back to the previous thread ID. So it kind of manages this whole GPT context for you. Because keeping context is a super hard question, and I'm sure that this extension is the first, or maybe one of the first stuff to solve it, but it'll be a thing that we'll have to keep working on, because one of the superpowers of ChatGPT is the context, and we need to milk it as much as we can.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, first of all, congratulations to your project. I find it very interesting. Secondly, I have 3 questions. Second question, why you call him and not her? I would call it her. And third, a serious question, intellectual property. So, I mean, this is very cool, no? And this is your own property. So how you're confident that this is not get away from you and used by, I don't know, here we have Bacardi in Geneva, and I'm sure that someone from Bacardi will be very happy to reuse this code for their own business. So how do you think about, this is more an open question, about intellectual property in an AI world where actually your data are lost and you don't have any right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll take the first one first because I really appreciate it. I sometimes make the mistakes because, like in Hebrew, it's he, but definitely I'm working on it. I'm not. I think it's important, so that's why I'm putting so much stress on it. Just not talking in a non-gender neutral way. I'm still making the mistake sometimes, but I'm stressing the response because I think it's important. So the second question, it's a good question. I mean, OpenAI say that they don't train the model based on it or only selectively train based on it. It's one of those things that you really can't know. I'll give you the example that I work at Cisco, and today in Cisco we can't use ChatGPT directly, but via some kind of proxy that makes sure that we're not leaking PII and sensitive information. That's a good question. I don't think we have a solution for that yet. Like, this is not an intellectual property that I care about being leaked. I don't know if I would have asked ChatGPT to build my startup.
Any other questions? We still have some time. Still early to get drunk for real. So yeah, there's a question there.
I can shout. Talking about DevOps, have you asked ChatGPT to deploy it and UAT?
That's an amazing question because I was planning on it. This is actually like a 2-part blog series. First one was the data engineering and indexing. Second part was the UI and API. And I wanted the last part to be ChatGPT deploying this application to the cloud. I didn't get to it yet. I did start playing with it. It actually produced some pretty valid CDK and Terraform outputs. I usually use CDK, but I don't have like a full solution working with it yet. But it definitely can. It generates, I think even, we kind of had a test run of generating infrastructure as code templates with it. We didn't because we couldn't use it. You couldn't have used it back then in Cisco, but we've been playing with it.
How do you think ChatGPT could influence the job of developer in the future?
That's a scary question, right?
That's the question everybody would like to have an answer.
That's a scary question. So I have, I think, two takes on it. One is that it's going to be a while before it can actually, write code and completely replace developers. It's still, as I said, a junior developer. But the second most, I think, more interesting part is that I always look at developers not as coders, but as problem solvers. And this new technology is just highlighting the fact that we need to focus more on problem solving rather than on coding. You could have said, the same thing on, oh no, we are not working with assembly anymore, we're working with Python. Now we need 1 developer to do 10 developers' job, but we just needed more developers ever since. So I'm hoping that I'm not, that I'll still have a job in a few years, but I believe that I will because I look at my job as someone who solves problems and create value rather than someone who just codes. Like ChatGPT is just a tool in my disposal to do that, but ChatGPT still needs a product.